Welcome to the 6th lecture in the 2016 Wilderness Issues Lecture Series, What's the Wild Work? We have 8 lectures in the series, so we have 2 more weeks after this week. So I'm going to go ahead and get started by presenting tonight's speaker, who is Dr. Evan Hjerpe. He's visiting us from Boise, Idaho. He is the Executive Director of the Conservation Economics Institute. As part of this role and others, he's a consulting economist based in Boise with experience focusing on conservation economics. He received his PhD from Northern Arizona University in Forest Economics and Management. He also served there as a visiting professor. Most recently, he was a senior economist for the Wilderness Society. His expertise includes conservation benefits, forest management, ecological restoration, and ecosystem services. He has consulted for private businesses, nonprofit organizations, federal agencies, and universities. Some of his current projects include looking at the economics and evaluation of potential takeover of Idaho's public lands. So many of you are probably familiar with that larger conversation across the West into public lands transfer from federal to either state or private ownership. We've actually discussed that in some context within this class. So Dr. Hjerpe has actually done some work in that area. He's also looked at the valuation of ecosystem conservation and the valuation of ecosystem services from wilderness, which is one of the topics he'll be discussing tonight. Besides that, he'll be exploring models of economic valuation using case studies, including some of his work on the Tongass National Forest in southeast Alaska. And if you remember correctly, the Tongass National Forest, and a conversation I had with an economist on the Tongass, is the entire impetus for this whole lecture series. So it's fun to be able to explore that place-based case in tonight's lecture. So with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Hjerpe to our lecture series.
Thanks everybody for making it tonight. I'm excited to be in Missoula, and I'm really happy to see an entire lecture series devoted to economics of conservation. I'm a little biased. I think it's long overdue, but it's great that there's an entire spring series, and it looks like you've had some really great speakers and some varied perspectives on economics of wilderness, economics of conservation. And that's always helpful for you guys to critically think about these land use issues. And there are no silver bullets, and so there's a lot of different ways we can go forward. Thanks to Natalie for the invitation to be here. I want to, is it not, sorry, the mic. Okay, mic is live. Thanks to Natalie for having me here. And I want to just add a little bit to that introduction. I've spent a lot of time working in academia, working in the consulting world, and working in the conservation world. And through that time, I see that there's a great need for more of a focus on the economics of conservation. And a couple of years ago, a couple of economists and myself, we started the Conservation Economics Institute. And at the Institute, we do applied research, and we really have a focus on impacting policy and land use policy. And our mission at Conservation Economics Institute is to apply economics to the sustainable use of our natural resources, the development of healthy communities, and the conservation of nature. And much of what I'm going to present tonight, much of this research has been conducted within the confines of CEI. So I want to give you first an outline of where I'm going to go tonight. We're going to cover some ground, but I think it'll be very relevant to a lot of what you've already heard, but hopefully some new perspectives as well. And I want to dig deeper into the need for greater economic investigation of conservation efforts, And I want to present this in three unique economic perspectives. And these filters, I'm going to talk a bit about ecosystem services, a bit about total economic valuation and willingness to pay, and then market impacts as well. And within these three filters, I'll present 4 of our recent research efforts in these arenas. So let's get started. What's $1 million view worth? Kind of sounds like a trick question, huh? Maybe the answer's in the question. Perhaps it's an old economist joke. It's not, but it's kind of both a trick question and a joke. The idea is that the appreciation of a view such as this, we don't tabulate that in terms of quantifying the dollar worth of that. We don't tabulate that within our internal budget. It's a different sort of value to us, and it's a non-market value. And so concepts like the appreciation of a view, or the pursuit of solitude, or the appreciation of natural environments, these are inherently non-market values. And non-market values, they are not incorporated well into our current economic system. They're not incorporated well into capitalism. Capitalism is focused on short-term profits, and it's focused on short-term impacts. And so because of this, non-market values are also not incorporated well into land use policy. And that means we need a much more deliberate focus on thinking about some of these things. So conservation economics can be defined as the maintenance and the repair of the natural environment for opportunities in the future. And today, a lot of conservation efforts are combinations of looking at preserving intact pieces of land in terms of wilderness designation and surrounding those lands with ecological restoration of surrounded lands that may have been degraded through exploitation or other means. And so conservation is broadened into both preservation and ecological restoration. And of course, we're trying to avoid as much degradation as possible from the business as usual. This focus on long-term sustainability and future generations is really critical in a time of decreasing natural capital and also in times of climate change, where climate change is altering ecosystems. So it's, the long-term sustainability is very important. One of the reasons we need more economic messengers is that we don't have a whole lot out there. We need to have a deliberate focus on this. This first one, maybe a little before most of your guys' time, Captain Planet and the Planeteers. This was a Turner Broadcasting Network show back in the early 90s. As you might guess, it only lasted maybe a season, maybe 2. Captain Planet was a start. Personal favorite of mine is the Lorax. And of course, this is Dr. Seuss's Lorax, that Lorax speaks for the trees. And we need somebody to speak for the trees, because they don't talk. We also need somebody to speak for biodiversity. We need somebody to speak for future generations. So if we have the desire for our children and our grandchildren to actually have nature to interact with, we need economic messengers for conservation. My latest new favorite is Chefs for Seals here. They are a group out of British Columbia of chefs that are dedicated to purchasing and using only sustainably harvested fish. And while I'm making light of these economic messengers, they're very important, especially having a market-based approach. But we don't have many. If we had 1 million of these messengers, we'd be in a better place, but we don't. And so what we're missing are economic messengers that can talk to Congress, that can talk to public decision makers, and that can impact public behavior. And we really don't have a whole lot of those. One of the early conservation economics messengers was John Crutilla. And he had a famous article in American Economic Review in 1967 called Conservation Reconsidered. And in this article, he came up with a couple of novel economic concepts. And this is a really great quote from his article. And remember, this is back in the late 60s. But this idea that natural environments will represent irreplaceable assets of appreciating value with the passage of time. This concept is, it's in direct conflict, or the direct opposite of how most of our economic systems work. We depreciate all of our commodities and goods rapidly. We discount the future early and often, about 5% every year. And that means that the future services that ecosystems might provide us are heavily discounted. And so Kurtilla really came up with these novel concepts. He also talked about the idea of irreplaceability. And he used the example of the Grand Canyon in terms of irreplaceability. There are not a lot of substitutes for pristine, intact wilderness and nature. And that has serious economic ramifications. He also talked about the idea of irreversibility, in that if we dam up rivers, if we clear-cut timber, if we mine the ore, we can irreversibly change these ecosystems, at least for the next couple hundred years. I suppose in the long run, everything's going to turn to dust. But he also coined a lot of these ideas of passive use values. And passive use values include option values, existence, and bequest values. The idea that something as special as the Grand Canyon could exist, a lot of people hold a lot of value for just knowing that it exists. And that existence value is very important. And bequest value is this idea of what are we going to leave for future generations. And all of these involved time scales. And I want to note that Kurtilla did this in a paper with nary a single equation, which is pretty incredible for an economics paper. He did go back with Anthony Fisher from Resources for the Future, and they did start mathematically operationalizing a lot of these concepts after this. But it was a pretty important paper that he presented just economic ideas on. In the 80s and in the 90s, environmental economists began trying to figure out how to value these passive use values, non-market values, all these different values. And so they really got into the tedious accounting of the different values. And this is a nice illustration of, if you think we have ecosystem structure and function out on the land. And that structure and function, they produce these ecosystem goods and services. And from these goods and services, there are values that are yielded to people. And these values can be broken into use values. They can be in the passive use values. There's a range of them. But one important thing to note about is this idea of a feedback mechanism. We are constantly modifying our ecosystem structures and function. And this human action, this can be in terms of wilderness designation, that could be no action. But most of it are visible, tangible human actions. And so ecosystem structure and function is constantly being modified, which is constantly altering the goods and services produced and constantly altering the values we hold for those goods and services. One thing you'll note about this concept of total economic value, it doesn't include jobs. It doesn't include market impacts. And so market impacts such as jobs, output, income, while they're important for our survival, we need a job, we need income, they're not part of a value. They're separate, they're impacts. And the reason is that jobs and other economic impacts are really just redistributions of wages and wealth. And they're not inherent benefits to us. And this redistribution of wealth means that they're outside of the consideration of this total economic value. And total economic value is used to do benefit cost analysis. If you think about the idea of Glacier, if Glacier didn't exist, we would all likely go bowling a lot more. And so bowling would see an uptick as an industry or something along those lines. But that's the idea. Basically, economic impacts are just redistributed wages and income that move from area to area. So the first filter I want to provide or talk about is this idea of ecosystem services. And I want to start with ecosystem services because it's in vogue right now. It's popular. The Forest Service's new management paradigm is ecosystem services. And you guys have probably heard a lot about this idea of ecosystem services. Well, what are they? They're the benefits provided by nature to mankind. Well, that's kind of broad. What does that entail? I mean, to me, that kind of sounds like maybe nature's 401k plan, maybe nature's health plan, something like that. I like to think of it in a little more classical economics terms, in terms of utility. It's how nature provides for human well-being. It's the food and water, and it's the raw materials that are provided for us. That's still a little stiff sounding. Maybe it's, how nature helps people survive and allows us to be happy while surviving. And this idea of ecosystem services as being all the benefits that nature provides, being such a broad definition, it's been a nice metaphor for relating to the public. But this breadth in terms of the definition causes a lot of problems for evaluation and for accounting. So the first filter in terms of ecosystem services is I want to present the services I found and thought about from a trip into the Bob Marshall Wilderness in the summer of 2013. So a few summers ago, I went into the Bob Marshall Wilderness with two colleagues, one being Andrew Larson here of the College of Forestry and Conservation, and the other being ecologist Travis Belote, who works for the Wilderness Society in Bozeman. And they've been leading a fire ecology class in the Bob Marshall probably for 6 years now. And they take students in there and they do a lot of data collection. And so they're looking at the Bob Marshall in terms of the re-entry of natural fire regimes and natural disturbance. And they're collecting a lot of data on monitoring revegetation in old fire scars. And they're also looking at legacy, what was left, what survived the burns. And it's, we were in there for 10 days, and it was a great class, and it was a lot of work, but of course it was beautiful, and it was a great trip. Being an environmental economist, I slightly intrigued about the taxonomies of different plant species, but I'm a little more interested in the economics of things. And so I had an ulterior motive being in there, and I wanted to think about how ecosystem services from the wilderness are unique from ecosystem services from other non-wilderness areas. So first we looked at some of the provisioning ecosystem services. And while we were in the Bob Marshall, we brought in our own food, but we got plenty of clean drinking water to drink on. And then we had a lot of food supplements that helped out the food that we did brought in. And we found native berries, onion, mint, lots of native cutthroat trout that were delicious. And we saw all these provisioning ecosystem services. And one thing we saw, this really struck me. This picture here is a picture that to me represented historical ecosystem services from the wilderness. And this is probably a 500-year-old ponderosa pine that has bark scarring on it. And so the natives would collect cambium wood and sap to supplement their foods and their diets. And they would do it in a sustainable manner where the tree was no worse for the wear, and they were able to collect it year after year. And so I thought this was a nice example of sort of a historical provisioning ecosystem service from the wilderness. Of course, we saw lots of regulating and supporting ecosystem services. And regulating and supporting ecosystem services are indirect services. They are not the final good and service that we consume, but they are builders and they provide for the final goods and services. And these include water purification, they include nutrient cycling, pollination, climate regulation, and waste absorption. And in a lot of the old fire scars that we were looking at, we noticed a lot more pollination. We noticed a lot more nutrient cycling, a lot more scarification. And so these supporting services can be unique in areas where natural disturbance regimes are allowed to continue. And certainly the cultural ecosystem services were probably most visibly on display. You guys are most familiar with recreation. We saw a lot of guides and outfitters in there leading people in for fly fishing, boating, rafting, pack rafting. There's hiking, backpacking. Yes, the recreation in the Bob Marshall Wilderness is stellar. And it was an obvious cultural ecosystem service. But there's also spiritual benefits. And these include that appreciation of a view. These include the idea of solitude and The ideas of just knowing that some of this natural capital exists in a somewhat basically pristine state. And that leads to a lot of the passive use benefits. And one example of that was one late afternoon while we were doing some veg monitoring. We had a wicked thunderstorm, and right after that, or actually during, while the thunder was still going, a pack of wolves right next to us just started howling, and it sounded like they were echoing the thunder. And that really just kind of struck us all. We all just stopped and listened, and that's part of the spiritual benefits that you can find in wilderness. And then the option value, I didn't talk about that before, but Kurtilla talked about this idea of genetic material for the future. And the idea is that wilderness may hold magical, medicinal cures for diseases, all sorts of things. And we'll never know that if we wipe it all away. And so that's the idea of some option value. And of course, there's one very important cultural ecosystem service from the wilderness. In fact, two of the founders of the Wilderness Society in 1935, they listed this ecosystem service as the first means and justification for preserving wilderness. Does anybody have a guess on what this cultural ecosystem service might be? I'll wait you out. Oh, maybe I won't.
Refuge from society.
Thank you for guessing. No, but I like that one. That's inherently part of the cultural ecosystem services. This one was scientific investigation. And so wilderness is an incredible living land laboratory that we can use as a control to understand how natural systems work, and we can use it to help inform all sorts of different things in different places. And so Aldo Leopold even wrote a wonderful essay on wilderness as a land laboratory. It's a critical ecosystem service, and of course I'm a bit biased as a researcher, but scientific investigation is a critical service. And along with that are the ideas of education and cognitive enrichment. And so we were learning a lot in the field, looking at recent fire scars, and for the class it was an amazing education tool. And it got even better. We were halfway through the class and we moved down to another data collection site. We moved about 10 miles down the river, and lo and behold, a lightning strike from 2 days earlier had been smoldering. And this hot, windy afternoon, it blew up. And it blew up right in front of us. And it was an incredible education experience. And it really, it made the fire ecology class. And I want to see if this works here. So this is a real quick video of the Damnation Fire as we came up, and I'll start with the no audio here. But it was impressive, and we got to watch this for 2 days. Luckily, we had prevailing winds where we weren't even getting smoked out. We were able to stay right there, and we watched it go ridge to ridge over and over. And there were no helicopters there. There were no base crews of firefighters. It was a wilderness fire, doing what fire has done for eons in the wilderness. Okay, now I want to try one other thing here with the audio. So instead of, we should have been running for our lives, or at least floating the heck out of there quickly, and instead we were wondering how fires were named.
Okay, at the August South Fork of Flathead, we have currently unnamed fire. Yeah.
Yeah.
I got the name one fire, called the Grandma Fire.
It's an excellent place to leave you. If you have any questions about the Grandma Fire, you're going to have to find Travis Belote in Bozeman and see what happens there. So there were a lot of ecosystem services on display in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, obviously. The difficulty is teasing out those differences. And nature does it best. And what I mean by nature does it best is that nature provides the optimal mix of biodiversity. Nature provides the optimal mix of ecosystem services. In our pursuit of one or two individual ecosystem services, we end up tampering with it and altering it, and those become more important for society in general. But it's difficult to tease out those differences between really pristine nature, the ecosystem services from wilderness, and those not from wilderness. And this is a bit of an extreme example. If you look at an urban area and a wilderness area, they both are going to provide water filtration. But it's really difficult to actually measure the biophysical effectiveness. Part of this is because the urban area is starting at a much more polluted level. And so wilderness restricts a lot of that initial pollution. And then in terms of their biophysical effectiveness, it's difficult to measure that. And it's incredibly difficult to measure that everywhere, every place, all the time, for all the different components. And with that, it also makes it hard to assess the economic value of those. And so this was an urban and a wilderness example, but even on public lands, it can be very difficult. And so this would be a single tree regeneration from windthrow in a southeastern Alaskan forest. And this is another way of regenerating a forest with a clear cut in southeast Alaska. But they lead to very different forests. And so here you can see the productivity is spaced out between the trees and the understory. And then in a lot of clear cutting, you'll go through long stages of stem exclusion, where the productivity is forced only into the trees and it's lacking in the understory. And this has a lot of impacts on wildlife and all the subsequent services provided. And it's this idea of going back to this total economic valuation of human actions. It's a constant feedback mechanism that is constantly altering ecosystem structure and changing our goods and services and changing the values for that. So one good way of valuing conservation and ecosystem services is to kind of avoid some of the minutia of the biophysical effects and actually go straight to the valuation of what people are willing to pay for conservation efforts. And with this includes a lot of non-market valuation. And there are two broad categories of non-market valuation: revealed and stated preference methods. Common revealed methods are hedonic pricing, travel cost methods. And they're sometimes called mixed market methods, because they utilize some market indicators to tease out non-market attributes. But the stated preference methods, including contingent valuation and choice experiments, are the most complete way to measure total economic value. And this is the idea of asking people exactly what they're willing to pay for changes in these ecosystem services. And contingent valuation has been in place since the 80s, and it had a lot of criticism early on, but it was validated in one case by the NOAA Blue Ribbon Panel and Kenneth Arrow, who was looking at the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Prince William Sound in Alaska. And they needed to come up with a way, for legal purposes, to figure out how to pay off these natural resource damages. And part of this contingent valuation was actually used to pay out lost passive use values to natives in Prince William Sound. And now, most of the contingent valuation has evolved to choice experiments, conjoint analyses that include choice experiments, include contingent ranking, and other methods. And these have reduced a lot of the hypothetical bias that came with early CVM studies, and they've really advanced quite a bit. And choice experiments have also been validated quite a bit. They are used to accurately predict willingness to pay for bond measures for open space, bond measures for watershed restoration or wildfire risk reduction. So communities are actually taxing themselves now to pay for a lot of these non-market values that are not being considered within the market. And choice experiments are a great way to predict that. Currently, the Forest Service, the BLM, EPA, Fish and Wildlife, they all support total economic valuation and the inclusion of non-market values and the inclusion of passive use values. The problem is that they don't have a lot of resources to conduct primary studies. So when they're doing NEPA planning, they have to take whatever secondary data is available for them. And when you're talking about individual projects, a lot of the time, you're not going to have existing primary studies that measured the willingness to pay for conservation or for the total economic valuation. And so we wanted to look more broadly at these ideas of total economic valuation, and we conducted a meta-analysis of willingness to pay for conservation programs around the world, globally. And then we also did a case study looking at the Tongass National Forest and willingness to pay by Alaskans for conservation efforts on the Tongass National Forest. And I'm going to talk about these two. Our meta-analysis, we culled over 100 journal articles from around the globe that had conducted willingness to pay studies on conservation efforts. And these conservation programs included preservation, they included forest restoration, and they included freshwater restoration. And there had not been any analysis looking at the differences in willingness to pay by type of conservation effort. So we were very interested in that. We also were interested in looking at scope effects. And the idea with scope effects, it was one of the early criticisms of contingent valuation, is that whether or not willingness to pay for conservation adhered to neoclassical economic principles and behaved the same way that commercial goods or commodities do. And that would be the more you get, the more you're willing to pay. So the idea is if you order 10 pizzas, you're going to pay more for that than if you had only ordered 3 pizzas like you should have. But that's a decreasing marginal rate because after about 6 pizzas, you're tired of pizza and you don't want any of that. But the idea is that you're willing to pay more for a good. And that has been tested quite a bit in the literature, and more it's been validated in primary studies. And so we wanted to look at that in terms of the overall meta-analysis of many articles and many primary studies. And so our model specification was we wanted to really look at willingness to pay based on perceived changes in ecosystem services. We believed that people, while they might not know the actual biophysical metrics of how a forest will change under wilderness or under timber production, we believe that they have an idea of the overall changes in the quality and quantity of bundles of ecosystem services. And so we hypothesized that willingness to pay is a function of the changes of ecosystem services before and after implementation of the conservation program. And then it's also a function of context and valuation. So context would be what country are you in? What's the demographics of the people there? Do they have, what are their budgets like? And the valuation is just the different economic methods used to ascertain willingness to pay. And some of that is, did you do a face-to-face interview? Did you do a phone interview? Did you do a mail-out survey? There are many different economic methods. But the idea is looking at this change in ecosystem service bundles. And when you think about preservation and restoration, they're different. Preservation has a starting point of pristine. And the threat, all the primary studies that we collected on forest preservation was they were threatened with timber production. And therefore, they did a willingness to pay study to say, would you rather have this timber production or would you rather have preservation or wilderness? And so restoration is starting from more of a degraded point and then going to an improved matter. And that matters when you're talking about differences. Thus, we boiled it down to that the changes in ecosystem services are really just a function of type and scope of conservation program. So whether or not you're doing preservation, forest restoration, or watershed restoration, and the intensity of those conservation efforts ultimately determine an individual or a household's willingness to pay for conservation. So we ended up with 127 data points collected from 22 primary studies that used dichotomous choice contingent valuation, contingent ranking, and choice experiments. The studies were from Europe, Canada, and the United States from 1987 to 2013. And we needed to convert all willingness to pay numbers to a common metric. And we used consumer price indices from various countries to bring these down to 2010 US dollar equivalents. What we found was that forest preservation was valued the greatest. And if you look at these, basically these were all done, the conservation type and conservation scope were done as dummy variables. So the forest restoration and the freshwater restoration are compared to preservation here. And we see that preservation yielded the greatest value, then freshwater restoration, then forest restoration. And we did indeed confirm scope effects, where program low was valued greater than a small attribute-specific project, and program high was valued even more. We put together some within sample predictions for mean willingness to pay per household, and you can see that the forest restoration was about $45 for affected households. Freshwater restoration was about $70 for affected households, and preservation was about double that, $131 in the median category for preservation. And again, this makes sense that preservation would be valued more for the reasons I talked about earlier. It was interesting to look at the differences between freshwater restoration and forest restoration. And we believe that maybe just the value of water to our survival as a species had people value watershed, freshwater restoration even more. We also noted that forest restoration suffers from a lot of ambiguity in terms of its definition. So people don't always understand forest restoration and is often confused with commercial thinning on timber plantations or for timber production. The conclusions from our meta-analysis was that there was substantial willingness to pay globally for conservation, and that this willingness to pay varied systematically by type of conservation, and it also varied by the amount or intensity of conservation. And these estimates can be used for value or benefits transfer. In a number of NEPA cases where you might not have primary data, you might want to look at transferring these values and utilizing some of these values as opposed to just giving it a price of 0. The other idea is that value transfer and benefits transfer could really affect the overall policy implications in terms of benefit cost analysis. So while we were doing the meta-analysis, we were also conducting a case study, a primary study on the Tongass National Forest in southeast Alaska. And the Tongass National Forest has a history of old-growth clear-cutting programs. It started in the 1950s to settle some of the communities, and they had large pulp mills. And that old-growth clear-cutting continues. While it's toned down a little bit, they're still clear-cutting 30 to 40 million board feet of old growth in the Tongass National Forest, and it is the last significant old-growth clear-cutting on any U.S. national forest. So along with that, there's been about 500,000 acres that have been clear-cut. It's led to a lot of documented degradation in salmon streams and degradation in terms of the forest structure. You saw that picture earlier of some second growth that has impacts on wildlife. So given this degradation, there have been a number of conservation efforts that have been put forth in the Tongass National Forest. And these conservation efforts revolve around old-growth preservation, and they revolve around forest restoration and stream restoration. So we conducted a choice experiment for households in Alaska, and we presented them with a survey where we wanted to tease out their willingness to pay for these different attributes. And we used the attributes of watershed, forest restoration, old growth conservation, and choice experiments include a monetary attribute, and each survey participant received 4 different blocks, and they were randomized, and they included different percentages. And they were asked to choose between three choices. First is Plan A and Plan B that have different levels of conservation, and every choice also offered the status quo. You could always choose the status quo of continued timber production in the old growth and pay nothing for that. And that's important to always offer a status quo alternative. We had 394 final respondents from throughout Alaska that answered all choice experiments. And our sample was very representative of overall Alaskan demographics. And this is important if you want to generalize your studies. You're really shooting to get a representative sample. And our descriptive statistics also followed general patterns. So for example, what's been found in a lot of studies is that higher income, more educated, older females have higher willingness to pay for conservation. And so there's a number of these patterns, and our sample was representative of those. So we wanted to also compare our case study with what we found in the meta-analysis. And again, what we found for the case study was that old growth conservation was valued the greatest. And both old growth conservation and watershed restoration showed scope effects, so they were valued more at higher intensity. And the one that did not yield scope effects was the second growth forest restoration. So something's going on here. The public doesn't see the value in really doing 100% of what we offered as the second growth forest restoration, but they do see value in the initial one. On the right, you'll see this extrapolated to the state. And so you can extrapolate your marginal willingness to pay estimates to affected households throughout the state. And there's been a lot of different studies on how far can you extrapolate. Well, the Tongass has very important values for those in Southeast Alaska, and we oversampled in Southeast Alaska to get closer residents weighted into the sample more. But there are also many national values and even global values. The Tongass has very important carbon storage in their old growth, and that has national value. And so people in the lower 48 would also be willing to pay, they would likely be willing to pay for conservation efforts. And so, but we were conservative and we just extrapolated these results to the state. And if you add these together, over $100 million or up to $100 million of value for conservation programs that is not being included in the NEPA analysis at the national forest level. To summarize our case study, we did it in a framework where we wanted to illustrate the best practices for doing choice experiments and streamlining them into Forest Service NEPA planning. And so these values should be included in efficiency analysis and benefit cost analysis. They can be included as benefits for conservation alternatives, and they can be included as lost values or cost for increased timber yields. And primary data collection is always the best, but benefits transfer is possible and can be better than assigning a value of 0. And finally, we did a focus in the article on talking about and figuring out how economists can do a better job of designing choice experiments to be used by land managers. Okay, the last filter that I want to talk about is market impacts. And while we know there's a lot of guide and outfitters, and there are certain wilderness areas like the Bob Marshall, like the Boundary Waters, Canoe Area Wilderness in Minnesota, that have a good market impact on the gateway communities, market impacts of wilderness is also, it's kind of a funny topic. I mean, really, wilderness and the intent of wilderness is antithetical to commercialization. And so wilderness is not going to win any jobs creation program when compared to extractive industries and when compared to other commercial aspects. The intent of wilderness was to be untrammeled by man, aka no Starbucks in your wilderness areas. The intent was that man would only be a visitor. So this limits, right off the bat, your ability to create market impacts. But nonetheless, there are quite a few market impacts of wilderness. And this is a recent study that we conducted on the national impacts of wilderness areas. And we did an economic contribution of all the estimated national visitors to wilderness areas. And contribution analysis is similar to what you may have heard about economic impact analysis, where you're looking at overall expenditures, you put it into an input-output framework, and you also look at what it includes in terms of indirect effects and induced effects. But contribution analysis is more appropriate for ongoing contributions. Impact analysis is more appropriate for the gain or loss of a new industry. We constructed wilderness visitor expenditure profiles. We came up with a typical or an average wilderness expenditure profile, and we used the National Visitor and Use Monitoring Data system to do this, and then we applied these expenditure profiles to a national input-output model. The National Visitor and Use Monitoring Data is probably the world's greatest recreation visitor database. It's a great resource, and they are finishing up their third round of surveying. They did first round in early 2000s, second round late 2000s, and finishing up the last round right now from 2010 to 2015. And what they do is they sample, it's a Forest Service-based sampling process, and they sample in 4 different areas, or 4 stratas. They sample at developed day-use sites, they sample at developed overnight sites, they do in general areas, and they also sample in wilderness areas. So we have some wilderness-specific data from this Forest Service recreation database. The spending profiles, so about 1/3 of all the participants that are surveyed in the National Visitor and Use Monitoring data set, they also receive and complete a supplemental economic survey to ask about their expenditures. All the expenditures that are asked about are within the region, so only within 50 miles of where they were recreating. And NUVM breaks this data down into 7 visitor trip types. On the right, you can see the allocations for the third round of wilderness visitors. So over 50% of wilderness visitors were local day users. Only 10% were non-local overnight, about 10% non-local overnight on the forest, and about 10% were non-local day users. And so we use this data to extrapolate to all wilderness visitors. So wilderness transcends different federal agencies. It includes the Forest Service, includes the National Park System, Fish and Wildlife, and BLM. But the reality is most of the wilderness visitors are on Forest Service sites, and we estimated that about 80% of overall visitation occurs on Forest Service lands, and the other 20% on the other lands. We found that overall, almost 10 million annual visitors to the wilderness areas. This is for 2012. And of note, wilderness visitation has been decreasing a bit. And we're trying to figure out what's going on there. But these numbers are a bit lower than the early 2000s. Of these 10 million estimated visitors, they spent approximately $500 million in 2012 in region. So again, that's only within 50 miles of the particular wilderness areas. These expenditures generated about 5,700 annual direct jobs nationally. And including indirect and induced effects, it's about 8,400 annual jobs. Here's a look at the direct and indirect and induced effects for labor income and value added and output. You can see that including total effects, the output from wilderness visitor expenditures was over 700 million for the entire U.S. And you can also see that the output has a greater multiplier effect. So very quickly, the direct effect is the expenditures that are used to pay for the services in terms of guides and outfitters and restaurants and bars. The indirect effects are the services needed to supply those direct effects. So it would be the ingredients and food and raw materials needed for a guide or an outfitter or a restaurant to provide that final service. And then induced effects are the recirculated spending that comes from employee wages. Top 10 affected sectors for wilderness visitor, kind of as expected, as you might think. Restaurants and bars top the list. Federal permits are second there, and then hotels and motels. And the guides and outfitters are included in amusement and recreation industries. So the final results of our National Economic Contribution Analysis of Wilderness Visitor Expenditures is that they are indeed producing a substantial side effect in terms of market impacts. Their multiplier effects for jobs was 1.5, income 2.1, 2.4 for output. So these multiplier effects are pretty low for a national defined study area. And basically wilderness is a small part of the overall outdoor recreation expenditures in the overall U.S. And they have lower multiplier effects than overall outdoor recreation, and they also have lower multiplier effects than extractive industries. But we need to look at the sustainability of these contributions. These can occur theoretically year after year without much impingement upon the environment. We can get overcrowding. There are some issues to look at in terms of tourism and nature recreation. But there are much more sustainable economic impacts than extractive industries in terms of the long run. And one thing that hasn't been considered much in the literature is the idea that wilderness has a unique economic geography. And so there's already a starting point and a reason why wilderness is not going to be able to compare to urban areas in terms of market impacts. It's because wilderness has been relegated to the least politically contentious areas, in layman's terms, to the least useful areas, because it was alpine environments, high mountains, desert, tundra. That's what was first initially designated as wilderness. And so it's interesting to think about that it has this unique economic geography. And this was recently validated by Akrig et al. In terms of their representation of ecological systems within the protected network. And what you'll see is that over 80% of our protected lands in the United States are at the very low end of soil productivity and at the very high end of elevation. So wilderness has a competitive disadvantage compared to our lowlands and our productive waterways, our ports, these sorts of things. But that high elevation and that unique economic geography of wilderness, it also attracts people. And so there's this other idea in terms of market impacts of amenity migration. And you'll hear more about this from Tom Power here in a week or two. But there are people, businesses and entrepreneurs that are relocating to be close to wilderness areas. And they bring investments and capital with them. So this produces a positive effect for the regional economies surrounding wilderness and the gateway communities. There's been a number of studies that have made a clear case illustrating that for all protected lands, amenity migration provides for positive regional economic impacts for gateway communities, but it's difficult to tease out wilderness specifics. So are people moving to be close to wilderness? Are they moving to be close to public lands, to mountains, to open space? It's a whole set of attributes that people are relocating for, but wilderness is an important one of those attributes. And then finally, there's been no peer-reviewed studies that have illustrated that wilderness has a negative effect on regional economies. And in fact, most of them have illustrated positive effects in terms of job creation and in terms of incomes and wages. So I'll wrap this up now. some of the conclusions here is that there's significant economic value for protected lands, locally and globally. And much of this value is comprised of non-market values, and that makes it a bit of an oddball in terms of fitting in with our capitalistic society. But conservation economics and total economic valuation can greatly inform land use policy and public behavior. And again, we just need to consider and be aware that conservation assets are of a different economic nature. And this means that we need more of a deliberate investigation and an outreach on these conservation benefits. I definitely want to thank co-authors on this research, Anwar Hussain, Tom Holmes, Eric White, and Spencer Phillips. I want to thank the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, the Forest Service, and the Wilderness Society for support on this research. If you're interested in seeing more of the details, methods, and the write-up, the meta-analysis on global ecosystem conservation is in the Journal of Forest Economics. The Ecosystem Services from the Bob Marshall Wilderness is an essay written up in the International Journal of Wilderness. And the Tongass case study is coming out soon in Ecology and Society. And the market impacts of national wilderness visitation is coming out soon in Society and Natural Resources. You can find all of this and more at the Conservation Economics Institute website. And I will finish with that. Thanks. Any questions? Not a real talkative crowd there. I tried once, but.
Impact analysis and contribution analysis, is there a fundamental difference in the approach or in its terminology? So looking at annual versus one-time impact?
It's largely terminology, but the main difference is that economic impact analysis is for looking at the creation of a new project or the loss of a project. Contribution analysis is looking at the annual, ongoing, if you're perceiving that to go into the future. One other thing is that regional economic impact analysis is very concerned with the location of the expenditures and the location or the residency of the visitors. And so regional economic impact analysis does not include locals within that because that's just a recirculation of their income.
In your Tongass case study, when you asked people, when you surveyed people and asked them what they'd be willing to pay, whether it was this situation or this situation, did they know what the purpose of the study was, or were they biased to think that they would actually have to pay that or not pay that?
That's a great question. So the idea with the choice experiment is that you first introduce the study to them, and you need to do all this within a relatively brief amount of time because people don't have they don't want to spend too much time doing a survey. So you introduce who's doing the survey, why you're doing it, and then you inform them on the different alternatives. So you provide some background information. You try to do it as unbiased as possible. You say, here's the status quo, here's the current situation, here are the potential changes in attributes in terms of wildlife populations or these other attributes under the different conservation alternatives. So you provide them with some information. And in our meta-analysis, we really thought about this idea that the willingness to pay is dependent on really their perceived notion of what's going to change. And some of that perception is based on the survey itself can influence people. So if you don't know anything about the topic, you're going to assume that what has been told to you in the survey is true. But you're also surveying a lot of people who are close to the situation, who already have a lot more information than what you're providing them in the survey, and also have a lot more preconceived notions of what's right and wrong.
Do you weigh any other demographics than like location to the site, like by race or socioeconomic class?
Absolutely. You need to consider that. So the whole point of a choice experiment and even a ramped up meta-analysis is to be able to generalize your results. And you can only generalize as far as what your sample represents. And so you need to have strong statistical power. You need to have a certain number of samples. But let's say I did a survey tonight, the sample would be really only generalizable to college students, and really only to college students in Missoula. So you really need to think about how to generalize out. And yes, so part of the survey, while we present the information, we collect full demographic information, and we even go as far as to include information on are you part of a working industry group? Are you a member of an environmental group? So we pull out all these different attributes of the respondents. Natalie?
So I noticed that, and I thought you did a good job of looking at a few different examples in different types of values, but a large part of the conversation around wilderness is based on recreation and the types of values and direct benefits or indirect benefits of recreation in wilderness. But as you mentioned, one of the original purposes of wilderness was for scientific investigation, and then, as you mentioned, a step further, education. So are there any studies or attempts that are being done to quantify those values? And I'm just thinking out loud here, I don't know how you would do that, but I think of myself as an academic researcher. If I had to, say, pay an individual private landowner to conduct research, and they were going to pay, they were going to charge me so many dollars per day that I was out there doing work, a 10-year study could cost you hundreds of thousands, if not millions.
That's a great replacement cost method. You just came up with that. I need to incorporate that. That's a good idea.
So is there any attempts to look at those associated values with wilderness, or just public lands in general?
There have been attempts, and those attempts have gone as far as putting a dollar value per journal article that has been produced based on wilderness. It's difficult, and it's difficult to translate it with good meaning. And so there are some attempts, and I like where you're thinking about. That's one way of going about it, is what's the alternative? What would you have to pay to go obtain this research? The other way of tracking some of this down is actually looking at the utility of specific science projects in terms of eco-mimicry. So what have we learned from nature that has been turned and commodified into Velcro or some other incredible widget? And you can track all that back, and then you can look at the amount of sales, and then you can try to partition out how much of that value came from scientific findings on wilderness. But overall, there have not been many attempts to do that, and the attempts that have looked into it have, they've been fairly topical and just kind of made some best guesses on what that dollar value might be. But I like your method. I'm gonna like it.
How often are these values used in making effective policy changes?
Not enough. They are used, and as I was talking about the federal agencies, so in terms of public lands, they are in full support of these values, and they have been codified. And the issue is that it takes a lot of time and money to conduct a lot of these studies. And so they naturally gravitate to feeding into their benefit cost analyses easily identified market values. And that would be board feet of timber produced. How much goes back to the U.S. Treasury? Recreation user days. How many permit fees were collected. Those are some of the ways. The non-market values are included, and there are a few cases of including those into benefit cost analysis. One is consumer surplus, where you measure the value of recreation beyond what you paid for it. So you paid a minimum amount, but it actually, you probably would have paid a lot more for it. So consumer surplus is that metric, and that's been included in a number of places. It's hard to streamline them directly in and make them apples to apple comparisons. But we're getting further in that, in these ideas of open space bond measures, and those are ways of immediately going out, surveying people to find out what their willingness to pay is, and lo and behold, we're finding people actually pay that. And so early on, contingent valuation suffered from what was called hypothetical bias. You're just asking somebody to pay for it, but they don't have to then finish the survey and then hand over the donation. And that's, over here, a question was asked about what do you do to prevent that, and there's lots of, they're called cheap talk scripts, other things. You really tell people you need to think about your budget and how much can you actually, don't just say you'd be willing to pay $1 million, because I know you don't have it. So there's ways of getting about it. Mark?
Yeah, I was curious, you know, the fire video that you showed, which is totally gnarly, by the way. So I don't know much, I mean, I know a little bit more about ecology, I know next to nothing about economics, so I'm just curious what the arguments from an economic perspective, and if you've looked into that as far as you know, the ecological arguments for and against fire suppression and putting it out versus letting it burn. How does the economic arguments there for and against get really loud, and how does that interplay with the ecological? Sorry if that's really broad.
No, that's a question that I am particularly interested in and am doing a lot of work on. And yes, they get particularly loud, those questions do. The main issue is that, you know, more than $2 billion of the Forest Service budget is now being spent on wildfire management. And the idea is to minimize each year's budget. And when you minimize each year's budget, it's cheaper to go put out every fire as soon as possible. Larger fires cost more. What you end up doing is kicking the can down the road. And you end up creating much greater budget need in the future. So those are really big economic issues, and we have not been dealing with them well because they're also sticky issues. Agencies, businesses, organizations have an inherent need to grow themselves. So you don't want to be reducing your budgets, and you need to be careful about looking too far in depth. And a good example is the value of previous fires. And we're starting to see that more and more in terms of communities experience a huge fire, they wish it had been put out immediately, and then next year they have a huge fire and it's about to take over the community and it lays down because it ran into a previous fire scar. Now, what's the dollar value of that? I'm trying to calculate that, and there's a lot to be said for that. And also, it's just we can't eliminate fire, so we need to think more in terms of, I don't know, Eastern philosophies of how you deal with something, as opposed to just we're going to eliminate fire. That's not working.
It sounds like it's almost analogous to the kind of like fossil fuel problem, where it's like, well, long term we need to invest in sustainable, but in the short term, it's like people argue against it because, well, we can't possibly convert all to, you know, is that a good analogy?
It could be.
Kind of the short term versus the long term.
Anybody else? Well, thanks.